Hi, it's Phil here from Revive My Ride, and in this video I'm going to tell you how often to replace brake fluid, and then once we establish that, how to replace brake fluid. But to be honest, apart from those things I mentioned, this is going to be a full brake fluid change guide. And that's because I'm going to cover everything from where your brake fluid reservoir is located, what brake fluid you should be using, how to drain brake fluid from your car, how to replace it, top it up, the whole shebang really. So stick with me, and by the end of it you should be the brake fluid replacement guru and easily be able to do this DIY at home. So let's get started with your brake fluid reservoir location. So 99% of the time the brake fluid reservoir is located in the engine bay on the same side that the steering wheel's fitted to. So if you just follow the steering wheel through the bulkhead, you'll find it here under a cover. And obviously that's because the driver operates the brakes, and it makes sense for the mechanism to be right in front of that. So these covers are all fastened in differently, but you'll find that there'll be some kind of clips or fasteners, and then this bit of trim will lift out. So on a Beamer there's 3 across the back and then a little hook at the front. So you undo those and then you just lift that out of the way. Okay, so here we are. So this is the brake fluid reservoir. I'm sure most of you recognize it. That's the master cylinder, and you can even see the brake lines coming out of it, which goes to each of your 4 brakes on the car. I'm only mentioning the master cylinder's location because I'm going to refer to it again later, because when we're draining and refilling, we're going to try to make sure no air gets down into the master cylinder. The other thing we're going to do while we're here is make sure that the top of the reservoir and the cap itself is really nice and clean. And that's because we know we're going to be taking this cap off, and we want to make sure no contaminants drop down into the brake fluid reservoir. And to do this, I just have some soapy water in a spray bottle that I mixed up, and a clean rag. And if you want to get into all of these little crevices and things, you can use an old toothbrush. Or if you're really dedicated, you can use your current toothbrush. I know some of you guys love your cars. So as you can see, my reservoir is not very dirty, but just for good form, I'm going to give it a little spray anyway. Beautiful. Apart from that here. Now it's beautiful. So we're not going to undo this cap right now, but what I will do is loosen it just a little bit, because I just want to make it so that you can read the stuff. Because the easiest way to find out what type of brake fluid your car takes is most of the time is just read the cap. So you can see here it says .4 fluid from a sealed container. And if your brake fluid cap doesn't tell you what brake fluid you should be using, you can always refer to your owner's manual. Well, these things are always really boring, so hopefully it tells you on your brake fluid cap. And so in preparation for this job, I bought a litre of brake fluid, a .4. And for my North America viewers, 1 litre is approximately 1 quart. At least that's what Google tells me. I'm not used to working with quarts, to be honest. And regarding the brake fluid brand, pretty much any leading brand that you've heard of will do the job. So here you can see I'm using Pagid, there's Mintex, Brembo, Castrol. I'll put a few links in the video description, but basically if it's a good brand and it says .4 on it, that's the spec, and so it has to meet that spec, and so you'll probably be okay with it. Now that we've introduced the .4 brake fluid, which is the most common type in modern cars these days, and therefore the most likely type for you to need, it feels like a good time to talk about how often to replace brake fluid. So all of the major car manufacturers, be it Ford, Vauxhall General Motors, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, you name it, they all seem to recommend a 2-year interval as how often to replace brake fluid. And so why is that? Because changing your brake fluid every 2 years seems to be overkill, right? Because what can possibly go wrong with it in that amount of time? It's just in that reservoir and it's sealed up inside your brake pipes. Well, the problem is your brake fluid reservoir cap has to be vented, because otherwise when you use the brakes and the fluid moves down, then the reservoir would collapse because no air would come in to take the place of the fluid that's moved on elsewhere. And so even though it appears to be a sealed system, the brake fluid is actually exposed to the atmosphere, at least to a small extent. And now we're starting to get to the crux of the problem, because brake fluid is hygroscopic, which means it readily absorbs moisture, water, from the air. But what's the big problem? I mean, it's a hot day out there, and some nice cold water sounds about perfect for me right now. Well, it turns out that the braking system doesn't agree with me, and it doesn't want any water. And that's because whenever you think about water in cars, you also think about corrosion, especially if you've got some old cars like I do. And so it turns out that once your brake fluid has absorbed a certain percentage of water, then you run the risk of getting corrosion in your braking master cylinder. And your brake calipers have pistons inside them, and it turns out they don't appreciate the moisture content either. And so corrosion in your braking system is a pretty compelling reason to change your brake fluid more frequently. But it's not the only one, and there's actually an even more important one, and that's about braking performance. Brand new DOT4 brake fluid has a boiling point of 230 degrees C, which is about 450 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is known as its dry boiling point because brand new brake fluid has 0% water in it. But testing from brake fluid manufacturers shows that after just 2 years, that water percentage has gone up to 3.7%. And that means that the previous 230 degrees C boiling point is now down to 155 degrees C. And the 450 degrees Fahrenheit is down to 300 degrees Fahrenheit. And now at this point, with moisture in the brake fluid, this is known as the wet boiling point. And of course, as the brake fluid gets older, the percentage of water in it goes up and up, and these boiling points come down and down. And so what's the big deal, a little bit of moisture in the brake fluid, apart from the corrosion issues that we mentioned earlier? Well, the problem is this. So under heavy braking, if your brakes are getting really hot, you can actually boil the brake fluid if you've let the moisture content get too high. And when the fluid boils, it causes a void either in the brake line or actually in the braking piston itself inside the caliper. And once you have a void in there, the next time you step on the brakes, it acts like a big spring. And suddenly you could find yourself with very spongy brakes with reduced braking performance. And in extreme cases, you could lose your brakes entirely, where your brake pedal feels like it goes to the floor and nothing's happening at all. Of course, that last one would be very extreme situations, very high moisture content in your brake fluid and suddenly thrown into a high performance situation for your brakes. But it's worth bearing in mind. And of course, if you've got a performance car like this one is, then it's all about the feel and the driver enjoyment. And so you want the best possible brakes that you can have. And also you need to be able to rely on them and for them to perform as you expect. So hopefully we're all in agreement that regularly replacing your brake fluid is a good idea. And I'll leave it to you to decide how frequently based on the information I've provided and how you feel about it. Anyway, time's ticking on and I'm keen to get on with this job, so here's how to replace brake fluid. Now that we've got the brake reservoir nice and clean, it's worth showing you how to check the fluid level. And even though the reservoir is semi-transparent, because the liquid is quite light coloured, it's hard to see the level. And so believe it or not, this is the technique, which is just to shake the reservoir. And once you're shaking it, you can kind of see where the level is and your eye knows where to look now. And usually somewhere on your brake fluid reservoir there'll be a maximum level and a minimum. And so when you shake it, you can see where that level is. It's approximately there. Now all we need to do is just loosen that cap slightly. So like half a turn. And that'll just make it a little bit easier to drain the brakes. Okay, and for the next step, you can see we're at one of the brake calipers. This is actually the front left. And you can also see that these are nice shiny 4-pot Brembos. And I'm quite proud of these because they're painted front and back and inside to the same quality as what you can see here. And you can only achieve that by removing these from the car and doing it properly on the bench, which not everybody has the patience for. But if you do and you want the best possible DIY results, then I've got a video coming out for it and I'll put the link in the description. Another thing you'll notice is the car's jacked up, it's on axle stands and the wheel's off already. Most of you guys will know how to do that, which is why I didn't cover it. But if you want to know how to safely get it into this sort of condition, I've got a video on it and I'll link that in the description too. Okay, that's enough self-promotion. Time to get back on with the job. Apart from showing off the paint job, the other reason I mentioned these are 4-pots is it means it has a couple of bleed nozzles. And the front one allows you to bleed the 2 pistons that are at the front. And of course the rear one allows you to bleed the 2 brake pistons at the back. And you're going to need access to both of those in order to drain your brake fluid, flush it through, and also to eventually bleed the brakes again. If your car doesn't have these extra pistons at the front, you'll probably find you just have 1 bleed nozzle round the back, which I'll show you now. Front one as we discussed. And hopefully you can just see the rear one just here. So being honest, this is the only risky part of the job, because what I'm proposing to do is connect a 1-man bleeding system to this bleed nozzle here, and I'm going to drain the brakes. And the issue is, especially on older cars, this bleed nozzle might not have been opened for quite a long time. And that means that they can be really tight to undo, and the risk is that you shear off that bleed nozzle and then obviously you've got a lot more work to do. But I've got a method that I use and I've had pretty good results with it so far on newer cars and on older ones. And the first step is at least a day before you decide to do this job, so leaving it overnight, you need to give these bleed nipples a good dose of WD-40. So obviously I've already done this because I'm ready to do the job now, so I put some on yesterday. But my tip is use a bit of cloth because you want to make sure WD-40 doesn't get sprayed onto the brake disc. And you only need a little squirt on it. There we go. And then I just wipe off the excess so it's not running all the way down the caliper. And hopefully you can see just a little bit of WD-40 is pooling there near the bottom of the thread. And you can leave it there just to soak overnight. And of course, if you've got another bleed nipple round the back, make sure you give that a squirt too. For the next step, you'll need to remove the bleed nipple cover, which is just a little push-on rubber thing. And what you need is the best fitting ring spanner that you can find. And bear in mind, it may not be a metric one. In fact, a lot of times bleed nipples are imperial because they're like a hydraulic fitting. And what I found is a 7/16 ring spanner fits this one the best. So sometimes this is the part that gets a little bit dicey, because if we just grab hold of that spanner now and pull as hard as we can until that comes loose, if that bleed nipple's really tight, then it might just shear off. And the reason for that is these are hollow, you know, because fluid needs to be able to come out of there, so they're not that strong. So here's the technique that I use that I was mentioning earlier. So the first one is put constant pressure on that spanner in the opening direction, which is always anti-clockwise. You don't have to push too hard, but just so there's some moving force in that direction. And then using a hammer that's not too large, I don't know what this one is, maybe a 1/4 pound or whatever, or an 1/8, just start tapping the end of the spanner. Now obviously I already loosened that when I painted my calipers recently, but originally it was really tight. You might find you have to tap the end of the spanner 50 times, because this is like a gentle hammer action, and what you're doing is you're shocking that bleed nipple free. And using this method you'll have a much better chance of not breaking that. So I mentioned this one-man brake bleeding kit earlier, and it has a little non-return valve in it, and that allows you to pump the brakes on your own with the bleed nipple open, and you won't get air and other things going back into your brakes when you come back off the brake pedal. So once you've got that bleed nipple loosened off so it's not too tight, you can just attach this to the end of the bleed nipple. And the way it works is you just have a rubber hose which you push on. And then this plastic thing, it just secures it in place. It's like a little collar, if you like. Just makes the rubber hose tight onto the end of the bleed nipple. So I've got the container supported on some blocks, but to be honest, this can just dangle and it'll hold itself on its own weight, you see, so it's no big problem. But it just makes it easier for me to show you on camera. Now all we have to do is open the bleed nipple about half a turn. Now all we have to do is keep stepping on the brake and releasing it again. And that'll send fluid from the brake fluid reservoir to that container that we have near the brake caliper. Just nice gentle pressure down. And then just release it slowly. And then again. And you should have been able to see brake fluid coming out of the caliper here and going down into the container. And all we have to do is keep repeating that process, but keep an eye on the brake fluid in the reservoir to make sure it doesn't run too low. And I'll show you now the level that you should be looking for. So if we come back to the brake fluid reservoir and we do our shake technique, I'm hoping that you can just see that the level's down there, but I'll mark it on for you. And so effectively what we want to try to do is get the level right to the bottom here. And that's about the lowest that we can go whilst making sure that no air goes down into the master cylinder below. And we don't really want the master cylinder below to run dry because it can be quite difficult to prime them again. So once you've got the fluid level in the brake reservoir down nice and low, you just have to come along and close the bleed nipple. Just something to make you aware of is that once the bleed nipple's open, it'll actually just drain through on the gravity. So all that time we were talking about keeping an eye on the level, this was dripping through slowly. So I didn't actually have to go and pump the brakes any more than I showed you on the camera. It was at the right level by the time I came round here. So I'm just going to empty out this container because I'd like it empty for the next stage in the process. And I just have this old bottle that I use for waste oil. It's worth wearing gloves because the brake fluid's corrosive. And to be honest, it's worth making sure that you clean up your paintwork if any's spilled on it because it can damage your paint. We're finally ready for the brake fluid top up, and then we can start flushing the brakes. So we'll start by adding some brand new fluid. And then once we've topped up the reservoir, then we'll start doing the brake fluid flush to each one of the calipers. And it's just a good idea to get a clean rag and just to tuck it down either side of the reservoir. Because like I said, brake fluid's corrosive, so if you spill any in this area, it might damage your paintwork. So I'm just going to take this cap off now and put it off to one side. And then I'm just going to fill the reservoir up. When you've finished topping up, it's always worth putting this cap on really tight and then putting the cap back on the reservoir. But remember, because you're flushing through now to the brake caliper, you still need to leave that like half a turn loose. And the level's about there at the top. Okay, so flushing the brake fluid through to each one of the calipers is a bit like bleeding the brakes, but now the idea is all of the old fluid that's still in the pipes, you want to get through the bleed nipple and then down into the container. So this is the same easy bleed container as we were using earlier when we were draining down the brakes, but now you'll see that I've put 100 ml or 3.5 fluid ounces a line for it. And that's a good rule of thumb for clearing the brake pipes coming to the front brakes because they're much closer to the brake master cylinder. And then you can see that I've put a second line on here, so that's 200 ml or 7 fluid ounces. That's because the rear brakes are a little bit further away and so the brake pipes are longer. So I'm going to go ahead and open the bleed nipple, similar to what we did before. And now you can go ahead and pump the brakes a little bit just to get this fluid coming through a bit faster. So that's about got it, 100 ml, 3.5 fluid ounces. So I'm just going to close the bleed nipple. And this time, because I know I've finished with it, I won't be coming back to this again. I'm just going to nip it up a little bit. Just bear in mind it doesn't have to be too tight. So I'm just going to pull this little white locking tab back, and then that'll enable me to take the rubber hose off the top. And there's just a small amount of brake fluid on my caliper there. So I've just got my soapy water from earlier. So I'm just going to clean that up. And then don't forget you have this bleed nipple cover still. So I'm just going to pop that on there. So remember me saying this was a 4-pot caliper. So what I've done effectively is bled the brakes through to these front 2 pistons. Now on the rear there's another 2 pistons. And this here is the bleed nipple for the back 2. So I don't have to drain quite as much through because the brake lines are all primed with new fluid now. But I do need to drain through just enough that these 2 pistons here have got fresh fluid in them. So it's a very similar process to before, where I'm going to connect up my easy bleed, and then I'm just going to open up this bleed nipple, and I'm probably just going to bleed through another kind of 50 ml at the maximum, just to make sure this rear one's been primed with the fresh fluid. Okay, so I'm ready to flush the brake fluid through to the front right brake caliper. But don't forget to top up the brake fluid reservoir between sessions, otherwise you're in danger of running that level low and then having to start again. But I won't show all this again because it's just the same again really. Okay, so that's the front brakes done. So they've both been flushed and bled and they're ready to go. But don't forget that you still have the rear ones to do. But the rear ones are again just more of the same really. It's the same process. Usually it's a smaller brake caliper and it's unlikely to be a 4-pot one like these. So what I'll do is I'll skip along to the end of the video and we'll assume all 4 brake calipers have been done and we're ready to do the final brake fluid level check. Okay, so when you do the final brake fluid top up in the level setting, there's just a small point to also consider. And this is it here. So this is my front brake caliper again, and as you can see it has absolutely brand new pads and discs on. And it's the same all the way round on this car, it has brand new brakes all round. Now this is only a small point, but the reason it's worth considering is with brand new discs and pads all the way round, what it means is the pistons on all of the calipers are as wide as they're ever going to be. And as the pads wear, the pistons will come out further and further and further. in the calipers, and what that means is more and more fluid will come out of the reservoir and effectively be in the pistons. So when you're doing the final top up and you know you have brand new brakes all the way around, then it's worth setting the fluid on the maximum because you know it's going to come down from there. But on the flip side, if you had worn brakes all the way around and you knew you were going to be changing them soon, then my advice would be just to top the brake fluid reservoir up halfway. Because when you change the pads for new ones, you'll push those pistons back and that'll send fluid back to the reservoir. And if you filled it up to full now doing this job, then it means you'll have to extract fluid from the reservoir. Which isn't the end of the world, but you know, it's just one of those things that'll just take you a little bit more time. Okay, so let's get to the final brake fluid level top up and check. Okay, so I mentioned that my brakes are brand new all round, and so the level's only going to go down from here as the pads wear. So therefore it's worth me putting this pretty much on the max. So we'll do our final shake check, and hopefully you can see the level is up there near the max. It's probably just a few millimeters below it, and that's close enough for me. So I'm going to put this cap on for a final time, and this time I'm just going to snug it up. Okay, if you stuck with me this long, then you should all be brake fluid change gurus by now and have all of the information you need to go and do this job yourself. If you like this content, then please give me a thumbs up, it really helps my channel. And I've got lots of other content coming up, like this car here is actually an accident damaged car that I'm fixing up from salvage, so I'm doing a video series on that. And of course I've got the how to paint your brake calipers properly video coming up if you want to get that sort of result on your brake calipers. So if this stuff interests you, then please consider subscribing and maybe I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching and hopefully I'll see you next time. Okay, bye for now.